Pope Francis visits forgotten community and turns tears into hope. When the shepherd touches the dry earth, a miracle springs from the depths, revealing ancestral secrets. Lives broken by drought find redemption in the pontiff's hands as a mysterious spring resurfaces after centuries. A story of faith, transformation, and healing that transcends religion. Prepare to be moved by this divine encounter. Like, subscribe, and comment on where you're watching this miraculous journey from. The sky burned in orange hues as Anthony Severino planted his hoe in the parched earth for the last time that day. His face, marked by wrinkles as deep as the cracks that cut through the soil, lifted to contemplate the relentless horizon. 3 years without a generous drop of rain. 3 years of unanswered prayers and hopes undone like dust in the wind. Sweat dripped from his brow as he gathered his tools, silent witnesses to his legendary stubbornness, the one that made him plow the land even when everyone else had given up. In the small village of Dry Gulch, nestled in a forgotten corner of progress, and sometimes even by God, Anthony thought, the simple adobe houses lined up along winding streets, where barefoot children ran despite the aridity that dominated everything. That hot afternoon, however, an unusual commotion took over the place. Hurried people, raised voices, news that traveled faster than the dry wind. Pope Francis would visit Dry Gulch within a month. Anthony arrived home, left his tools in the usual corner, and carefully washed his hands in the rationed water basin. His wife, Mary, was already waiting for him with bright eyes, almost feverish with enthusiasm. "Did you hear, Anthony? The Holy Father is coming to visit our community. Just imagine, out of all the places in the world, he chose our Dry Gulch." He nodded, without sharing the same fervor. At 42, Anthony had lost that luminous faith that had once been his sustenance. Prayers had not rained down. Novenas had not blossomed. The saints remained silent as the earth cracked under his feet, year after year. "And what will change with this visit, Mary? Is he going to bring the rain in his hands?" he replied, harsher than he intended, regretting it as he saw the brightness dim in his wife's eyes. Mary made the sign of the cross as if those words could attract more misfortune to the already punished land. "Don't talk like that, man. Faith moves mountains." "But it doesn't bring water," he murmured as he sat down for the simple meal. That same night, the bell of the small Our Lady of Hope church rang, calling everyone to an urgent meeting. The central square, normally empty at that hour, filled with anxious faces illuminated by the almost full moon. Father Joe, a middle-aged man with prematurely white hair and a perennial smile even in the worst moments, was visibly moved. "Brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "we received confirmation today that His Holiness Pope Francis will visit our community within a month. This is a blessing we cannot measure, a sign that the Lord has not forgotten Dry Gulch." A wave of excited murmurs swept through the crowd. Calloused hands rose in spontaneous prayers, eyes welled up, and even the children seemed to understand the magnitude of the moment. "We need to prepare as never before," continued the pastor. "Our church needs to be restored, our streets cleaned. We need to show the Holy Father that despite our material poverty, we are rich in faith and dignity." And then, to Anthony's surprise, the priest said what he least expected to hear. "To coordinate all the preparations, we need someone with determination, someone who knows every inch of this land and every person in this community. Someone whose strength unites us even in the most difficult moments. Anthony Severino, I would like you to take on this responsibility." All heads turned to him. The sudden silence weighed like the midday heat. Anthony felt his wife's gaze, a silent plea for him to accept. He saw the hopeful eyes of his youngest son, Michael, who served as an altar boy in the church despite his father's doubts. "Father," he finally said, "you know I am not the most devout man in this community." His voice sounded rough in the quiet night. "I am not looking for the most devout, Anthony, but the most determined, the one who plows the land even when the sky refuses to cry. Faith sometimes manifests itself in the stubbornness of not giving up." A restrained laugh rippled through the square. Everyone knew Anthony's legendary obstinacy well. "I accept," he said simply, not out of faith, but out of love for that community, for those people who face the same drought as him, with the difference that they still managed to smile at the merciless sky. The next morning, while the meager dew still lingered on the few plants that survived, Anthony was already at the church, assessing the work ahead. The roof needed repairs, the walls a new layer of whitewash, the worn benches needed sanding and varnish. He made mental calculations of the necessary materials when he heard hurried footsteps. It was Clara, the young catechist who had recently returned to the village after completing her studies in the city. Her brown eyes shone with an excitement that reminded Anthony of the times when the first rains arrived, bringing promises of a bountiful harvest. "Mr. Anthony, I found something that could change everything." Her voice almost failed with enthusiasm. In her hands she held yellowed documents, carefully preserved between pages of old books. "What could be so important, girl?" he asked, more out of courtesy than real interest. "This land," she pointed to the ground beneath their feet, "was not called Dry Gulch. It was known as Valley of Promise. These documents date back almost 200 years. They speak of an underground spring, a miraculous water that made everything planted flourish." Anthony took the papers with calloused hands, unaccustomed to handling documents. The letters danced before his eyes, but he managed to discern primitive maps and accounts that, in fact, described a land of abundance. "And what happened to this miraculous spring?" he asked, still skeptical. Clara lowered her voice, as if the church walls could be offended by her words. "The records say it dried up after a great sin committed by the community. They don't specify what, but they mention that the water hid in the depths, waiting for the moment of redemption." Anthony returned the documents, a sad smile on his parched lips. "Clara, you are young and full of hope. That's beautiful. But we need to focus on the real work we have ahead of us, not on old legends that only serve to fuel false hopes." The news of the ancient prosperity, however, spread quickly through the community, thirsty for any drop of hope. In a few days, two factions formed. Those who, like Clara, saw in the papal visit an opportunity for redemption that would bring back the lost spring, and those who, like Anthony, preferred to keep their feet firmly planted in the arid reality they faced. While the village was divided in opinions, Michael, Anthony's 10-year-old son, began to have vivid and recurring dreams. Every morning, he reported to his father with wide, excited eyes. He saw himself walking through rocky hills beyond the village, following a specific path to a rock formation that looked like a natural altar. In the dream, crystal clear water gushed from the rocks and a luminous figure blessed the spring. Anthony listened with a heavy heart. How to explain to his son that dreams don't quench thirst? That night visions don't make corn grow? However, the boy's insistence was so great that he finally agreed to accompany him to the place of the dream, more to prove that nothing was there than out of real expectation. On the morning of the expedition, to his surprise, a small group of villagers was already gathered in the square, ready to follow Michael. Clara was among them, carrying the old documents like a treasure map. "You allowed us to go?" she asked, genuinely surprised by Anthony's presence. "I came to make sure no one gets hurt among those rocks," he replied dryly. But the truth was that a reluctant curiosity had awakened in his drought-hardened heart. They walked for 2 hours, under the relentless sun. Michael led the group with the absolute certainty of someone following a map engraved on his soul. When they finally reached the place, Anthony had to admit, there was something peculiar about that set of rocks. They formed almost a natural amphitheater facing east where the sun rose. They found no water, of course, but they discovered something that made even Anthony frown in intrigued reflection. Ancient digging tools, corroded by time, and primitive Christian symbols carved in stone, combined with signs that seemed to belong to the indigenous peoples who inhabited the region centuries before. "Look, Dad!" exclaimed Michael, pointing to a particularly well-preserved inscription. "It's the same symbol that was in Clara's documents." Indeed, a stylized drawing of a spring gushing between two praying hands was engraved in the stone, identical to a still present in the yellowed documents. "This proves that the spring existed," said Clara, her eyes shining with emotion. "And if it existed once, it can exist again." Anthony did not answer. His gaze wandered over the rocks, the ancient tools, the signs of a feverish search that apparently had not borne fruit. How many before them had come here, moved by the same hope, only to return empty-handed? The work of preparation for the papal visit intensified in the following weeks. The community, despite the scarcity, showed a generosity that moved Anthony. They donated the little time they had between working in the parched fields. They shared materials saved for emergencies. The women prepared treats with the rationed ingredients to feed the workers. The arrival of the Vatican representatives, 2 weeks before the official visit, brought the first major obstacle. They were 3 men in impeccable suits, uncomfortable under the scorching sun, with clipboards and worried expressions. They assessed the church structure, the makeshift restrooms, the precarious water distribution system. "This does not meet the minimum safety and comfort requirements for His Holiness," declared the oldest of them, an Italian man with gray hair and gold glasses. "We suggest transferring the event to Oakhaven." Oakhaven was the nearest big city, 50 kilometers away, a city that for years had disputed control of the region's scarce water resources with Dry Gulch. The silence that followed those words was heavier than the midday heat. Father Joe looked at the ground, unable to argue against the irrefutable logic of those men. Clara held back tears. Michael squeezed his father's hand tightly. It was then that something broke within Anthony. Not his faith, not yet, but his pride as a man of the land, his dignity as a peasant who does not bow to the first strong wind. "With all due respect, gentlemen," his voice came out firmer than he expected, "I believe you have not understood the purpose of His Holiness's visit." The 3 representatives turned to him, surprised by the interruption. Pope Francis did not choose Dry Gulch for its infrastructure or comfort. He chose it because we are exactly what we are: a poor community, punished by drought but which maintains its dignity. If you transfer the event to Oakhaven, you will be denying the essence of the Pope's own message, that the Church must be with the most needy, not with the privileged. A murmur of approval ran through the small group gathered. Anthony himself seemed surprised by his words. Where did that sudden eloquence come from? Furthermore, he continued, motivated by the respectful attention he now received, if you give us the proper guidance, I guarantee that we will meet all safety requirements. This community may not have much, but it has the willingness to work like few others. The gray-haired Italian adjusted his glasses, observing Anthony with new interest. "And you are Anthony Severino, the man who plows the land even when the sky refuses to cry," he replied using Father Joe's own words, drawing smiles from his countrymen. After a brief conference between the representatives, the Italian turned again to the group. "Very well, Mr. Severino. We will maintain the original plans, but with strict preparation conditions. Tomorrow we will bring a technical team to guide you. You will have exactly 10 days to implement all the necessary improvements." It was as if a small rain had fallen on Dry Gulch. The dejected faces lit up with cautious smiles. Father Joe squeezed Anthony's shoulder with silent gratitude. Michael looked at his father as if he were a hero out of the stories his grandmother told. The following weeks witnessed something Anthony had not seen in years: the transformation of Dry Gulch, not by the arrival of rains, but by the arrival of something equally powerful: collective hope. Working together, the peasants renovated the old church, replaced the broken roof, painted the peeling walls with white lime that reflected the sun like snow. The dusty streets were cleaned, the simple houses gained improvised curtains made of colorful fabrics, and the central square flourished with decorations made of recycled materials. Plastic bottles transformed into flowers, old cans into decorative lanterns. Anthony, although still skeptical about faith, rediscovered the power of community unity. Every morning he distributed the tasks. Every night, he gathered everyone to assess progress and plan the next day. His house became the informal headquarters of the preparations, with maps and lists covering the adobe walls. Not everything, however, was plastic flowers and hopeful smiles. Sebastian Mendoza, the richest farmer in the region and owner of the only property with a functional irrigation system, saw the papal visit as a threat to the control he exercised over water in the area. For years, he had sold water to the peasants at increasingly higher prices, justifying the increase with the intensification of the drought. A week before the papal arrival, Sebastian appeared in the square during the evening meeting, mounted on his imposing horse, the only well-fed animal within miles. "I heard you are needing more water to receive the Pope," he said, his voice carrying that falsely supportive tone that Anthony knew well. "Unfortunately, I will have to reduce the supply by half starting tomorrow. My own reservoir is reaching critical levels." It was a blatant lie. Everyone knew that Sebastian's reservoir was supplied by an illegal diversion he had made in the small seasonal river, long before it reached community lands. But no one had concrete evidence, and the authorities in the big city always turned a blind eye to the farmer's irregularities. After all, his donations kept many political campaigns afloat. "That will make the visit unfeasible, Sebastian, and you know it," replied Anthony, keeping calm despite the indignation that boiled in his chest. "We need water not only for the visitors, but to complete the preparation of the square and the church." The farmer shrugged, a thin smile on his lips. "The world is tough for all of us, Anthony. I have my crops to think about. I cannot compromise my production because of a visit that, let's be honest, will not bring rain or change the reality of Dry Gulch." That night, after a tense meeting with the community council, Anthony couldn't sleep. Sebastian's words echoed in his mind, not for the malice they contained, but for the grain of truth they carried. What would really change with the Pope's visit? Dry Gulch would remain dry. The children would remain thirsty. The fields would remain barren. In the following dawn, before the first rooster crowed, an unexpected sandstorm swept through the community. It was not uncommon at that time of year, but its intensity caught everyone off guard. The wind howled between the houses like a wounded animal, tearing off makeshift roofs, knocking down the structures set up in the square, covering everything with a thick layer of reddish dust. When the sun rose, revealing the extent of the damage, many villagers fell into despair. Much of the preparation done in recent weeks had been destroyed. The church, fortunately, had resisted with minor damage, but the square, where the main event would take place, was unrecognizable under mounds of sand and debris. "It's a sign," murmured old Josephine, the most respected prayer woman in the community, "a sign that we are not worthy of this visit." Others agreed, crestfallen. The storm seemed to have carried away not only the physical structures, but also the fragile hope they had cultivated. It was at this critical moment that Anthony, surprising himself and everyone around him, asked the community to gather in the church. Not to pray, he was not ready for that yet, but for something equally important, to rediscover their collective dignity. The candles flickered inside the nave, partially darkened by the dust that had infiltrated through the cracks. The newly sanded benches accommodated people with slumped shoulders and defeated looks. Anthony remained silent for a long moment, observing those faces he had known since childhood, each wrinkle a story of struggle, each callous proof of perseverance. I'm not a man of faith," he began, his voice echoing between the stone walls. "You all know that. I lost my faith when I lost my third harvest to drought, when I saw my eldest son leave for the city in search of work, when I buried my father without having enough water to wash his body as tradition dictates." A respectful silence filled the air. "But there is something I have never lost, that none of us has lost, even in the worst moments. Our dignity, our ability to get up after each fall, to plant even knowing that we may not harvest, to take care of each other when all the sky gives us is indifference." Anthony paused, searching for the right words. "This storm is not a sign that we are not worthy of the Pope's visit. It is just another challenge, like so many others we have already faced. And you know what we do in the face of challenges? We get up, shake off the dust, and continue." A murmur of approval began to ripple through the church. Our worth does not depend on divine approval, or the visit of any authority, however holy. It depends on the dignity with which we face adversity together. And if there is one thing I know about us, about Dry Gulch, it is that our dignity is stronger than any storm. It was as if a small flame had lit up in each present gaze. Clara was the first to stand up, followed by Father Joe. Soon the entire community was standing, a spontaneous applause filling the church with more life than it had seen in years. In the following 3 days, Dry Gulch transformed into a human anthill. Men, women, and even children worked tirelessly to rebuild what the storm had destroyed. Anthony led by example, always being the first to arrive and the last to leave, ignoring the heat, thirst, and exhaustion. On the third night, exhausted beyond what his 42-year-old body could bear, Anthony fell asleep next to the church altar. He was helping to clean. He had a dream so vivid that when he woke up startled, he could still feel the rough touch of the hands that guided him. In the dream, his grandfather, dead for over 20 years, led him along the same path of rocky hills that Michael had dreamed of. But instead of stopping at the natural amphitheater where they had found the ancient tools, the old man guided him through a narrow passage between the rocks, descending along an almost invisible trail to a small opening in the ground, partially covered by stones and dry vegetation. "Water never abandons those who do not abandon it," said his grandfather in the dream, his voice exactly as Anthony remembered it, deep, melodious, and full of peasant wisdom. "It just hides, to protect itself from those who do not respect it." Anthony told no one about the dream. The next morning, taking advantage of a break in the preparations, he returned to the hills alone. Following the path he remembered from the dream, he discovered something they had overlooked during the previous expedition. A small grotto hidden among the rocks, its entrance almost completely closed by stones that, looking more closely, seemed to have been placed there on purpose. With effort, he removed some of the smaller stones and managed to pass through the narrow opening. The interior of the grotto was surprisingly cool compared to the suffocating heat outside. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Anthony discerned fascinating details. On the walls, carvings that combined primitive Christian symbols with indigenous signs. On the ground, circular marks that resembled the design of a spring. And in the center of the grotto, a perfectly round depression, like a small well dry for a long time. He knelt and touched the bottom of the well. The earth was completely dry, without the slightest sign of moisture. But something in the perfection of that structure, in the symbols on the walls, in the care with which everything had been arranged, told Anthony that this place had once been sacred, that there perhaps the legendary spring of the Valley of Promise had one day sprung. When he returned to the village, he found a scene that quickened his already restless heart. Sebastian Mendoza, accompanied by 2 henchmen, was arguing heatedly with Father Joe in the square. The subject, as expected, was water. "I regret to inform you," said the farmer, his tone falsely sorrowful, "that due to a failure in my pumping system, I will have to completely suspend the water supply until after the papal visit. It's a technical issue, you understand? There's nothing I can do." This time, the lie was so blatant that it caused immediate outrage. The assembled villagers protested loudly. The priest, although maintaining his composure, had a face red with frustration. "This is deliberate sabotage, Sebastian," said Anthony, placing himself between the farmer and the priest. "Are you afraid of what this visit might bring? Attention. To your illegal water practices, perhaps?" Sebastian smiled, unperturbed. "Be careful with your accusations, Anthony. I am not to blame if nature does not favor Dry Gulch. As for my practices, as you say, they are all duly legalized with the competent authorities." He lightly touched his hat in a gesture of false courtesy and turned his horse, leaving behind a community on the verge of despair. The news spread quickly. Without Sebastian's water, the papal visit would be impossible. There would be no way to meet the basic needs of the visitors, let alone complete the preparations that still remained. The community council met in emergency session at the church, seeking desperate solutions. "We could ask for help from Oakhaven City Hall," someone suggested. "They would never help us," replied another. "They would be happy to receive the Pope in our place." "What if we tried to dig a traditional well?" asked Clara. "The old records mention that there was water not very deep in this region." "We have tried that before," recalled old Peter, who had lost 3 sons to the big city. "We dug until we found solid rock. There is no accessible water under Dry Gulch, at least not with our simple tools." It was then that Anthony, who had remained silent until then, stood up. His face showed a fierce, almost feverish determination. "There's a place where we have not yet tried," he said, his voice low but firm. "The grotto in the hills." And so, as the sun set over Dry Gulch, Anthony shared his discovery and the dream that had guided him to it. He told of the symbols on the walls, the dry well, the marks that suggested an ancient sacred spring. "Are you proposing that we dig there?" asked the priest, incredulous. "There are only 3 days left until the Pope arrives. What do we have to lose?" replied Anthony. "If we don't find water, we will be in the same situation we are in now. If we do find it, even if it's just a trickle, it will be more than we have." The proposal was received with skepticism by the community leaders. The pastor warned that there was not enough time for an undertaking of that size. The elders expressed fear that disturbing a possibly sacred site could attract more misfortunes. Some even suggested that Anthony's dream was nothing more than delirium caused by exhaustion. "I'm not asking everyone to come," Anthony finally said. "Just a few volunteers with strength and willingness to work non-stop for 2 days." To his surprise, the first to stand up was Michael, his 10-year-old son. "I'll go with you, Dad." Then Clara and 5 other young people volunteered. In the end, a group of 12 people, a number that the priest could not help but note had biblical significance, committed to the seemingly impossible mission. The next morning, even before sunrise, the small expedition set off towards the hills with tools, ropes, improvised lanterns, and the little water they could gather. The rest of the community would continue preparations in the village, knowing that this was probably their last hope. When they reached the grotto, Anthony divided the group into shifts. While some rested in the shade of the rocks, others worked tirelessly, widening the cave entrance until they could transport the larger tools inside, and then digging in the center of the old dry well. The work was strenuous. The air inside the grotto, initially cool, became hot and dusty as the excavation progressed. The rock beneath the layer of earth was surprisingly soft, a kind of porous limestone that facilitated drilling, but still required constant effort. By the end of the first day, they had advanced about 3 meters in depth without finding any sign of water. Discouragement began to seep in like dust in their lungs. Even Michael, whose childlike faith had sparked the whole journey, showed tired eyes under his eyebrows, covered in white dust. "Maybe we should give up," suggested one of the young men. On the morning of the second day, "We've already dug deeper than any well in Dry Gulch has ever reached." Anthony, whose muscles ached like never before, whose eyes burned with limestone dust, knelt on the edge of the well they had dug. He looked at the walls of the grotto, at the ancient symbols that silently witnessed their efforts. He thought of Dry Gulch, of the children running through the dusty streets, of the renewed hope that the papal visit had brought, of the dignity with which his community faced each new challenge. "1 more meter," he finally said. "We dig 1 more meter, and if we don't find anything, we will accept that we have done our best." It was past noon when Michael, who had descended to the bottom of the well to replace his exhausted father, let out a cry that echoed through the grotto walls. "Dad, the earth is damp." Anthony hurriedly descended the improvised ropes. Indeed, the soil at the bottom of the well, which until then had been completely dry, now showed a darker color, a subtle dampness that made his heart race. "Keep digging," he ordered, renewed energy in his voice, "but carefully, very carefully." In the next 2 hours, they advanced slowly, each shovelful revealing increasingly damp earth. And then, when Anthony sank the pickaxe with particular vigor, a hollow sound was heard, followed by a noise of running water. The pickaxe had pierced a thin layer of rock that apparently covered a small underground reservoir. Clara, who was watching from the edge, was the first to verbalize what everyone was thinking. "It's a miracle. Michael's dream, your dream. The spring really exists. They carefully widened the hole until they could see the water. Not abundant, but enough to form a small well about a meter in diameter, with clear water that bubbled gently, as if happy to see the light again after centuries of darkness. News of the discovery spread through the village like wildfire. Before nightfall, practically the entire population of Dry Gulch had made the pilgrimage to the grotto to witness what many were already calling the miracle of the rediscovered spring. They organized a system of buckets and ropes to extract the water, which was carefully transported to the village in small barrels. Not everyone, however, shared the general enthusiasm. Sebastian Mendoza appeared at the grotto at sunset, his face a mask of distrust. "This is nothing more than a coincidence," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. Or worse, a fraud orchestrated to impress the Pope. "This water probably comes from some illegal diversion from my reservoir." Anthony, who was supervising the water extraction, faced the farmer's gaze without wavering. "Feel free to investigate, Sebastian. We have nothing to hide, unlike certain landowners I know." On the eve of the papal arrival, while the final preparations were completed with water from the newly discovered spring, a strange phenomenon occurred. The water, which until then had been crystal clear, acquired a reddish color. It was not a blood or rust red, but a soft, almost pinkish tone, like the sky at dawn. The change caused immediate consternation. Many villagers, superstitious by nature and upbringing, interpreted this as a bad omen. Old Josephine, in particular, recalled ancient stories about blood water that preceded calamities. "It is a sign that we have not yet atoned for the ancient sin," she murmured, making the sign of the cross repeatedly. "The Pope's visit must be cancelled before something terrible happens." Fear spread quickly, finding fertile ground in minds already stressed by the preparations and the expectation. Sebastian Mendoza, seeing an opportunity to sabotage the visit he so feared, appeared in the square offering generously water from his reservoir to avoid a tragedy. Father Joe, undecided for the first time since the start of preparations, asked Anthony to return to the grotto to check what could be causing the change in the water's color. When Anthony arrived at the spring, he found Michael already there, curiously examining the reddish water. The boy had filled a small jar and was shaking it against the light. "It's not blood, Dad," he said with the disconcerting certainty of children. "It's earth, a special kind of earth that mixed with the water." Anthony took the jar and observed it carefully. Indeed, it was not a homogeneous solution, but tiny particles in suspension that gave the water that peculiar color. He knelt beside the well and dipped his hand in the water, bringing some of the sediment to examine more closely. It was a fine clay, almost like talc, of an intense and uniform red. Something about that material awakened a distant memory. Stories his grandfather told about a healing earth, used by the ancients to treat wounds, fevers, and rheumatic pains. It was then that they heard voices approaching the grotto entrance. Unfamiliar voices speaking in Spanish with an Argentinian accent. Anthony and Michael exchanged looks of surprise and astonishment. Could it be possible? The light of advancing lanterns illuminated the grotto entrance before they had time to react. And then, there he was, shorter than he appeared on television, older but with that same gentle smile that had captivated millions around the world. Pope Francis, accompanied only by 2 security guards, and Father Joe, whose face alternated between embarrassment and excitement. "Your Holiness, these are Anthony Severino and his son Michael," the pastor introduced, his voice trembling. "They are the ones who discovered the spring." The Pope smiled, his tired but lively eyes fixing first on Michael, then on Anthony. "So you are the man who plows the land even when the sky refuses to cry," he said in Spanish, which Anthony understood reasonably well. "And you, little one, are the one who dreams of water in the desert." Michael, normally talkative, was speechless with emotion. Anthony nodded slightly, unsure how to react before the religious leader. "We arrived a day earlier than planned," explained the Pope, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to be there in that remote grotto. "I heard about this miraculous spring, and wanted to see it with my own eyes, without the formality of an official visit. His eyes rested on the reddish water, and I see that it has something to tell us. Anthony explained about the clay in suspension, mentioning the stories his grandfather told about medicinal properties. The Pope listened with genuine attention, occasionally asking insightful questions that demonstrated his surprising knowledge of popular healing traditions. When Anthony finished his account, the Pope remained silent for some time, observing the small spring that bubbled gently. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he sat down on a low stone and motioned for Anthony to join him. "You are not a man of faith, are you, Anthony?" he asked directly, but without judgment in his voice. "Not. As I should be, Your Holiness," he replied honestly. "I lost my faith when I lost my crops, when I saw my land die little by little." The Pope nodded understandingly. "Did you know that I too have gone through moments of deep doubt? Moments when God's silence was deafening?" Anthony looked at him, surprised. He did not expect such a confession from the leader of the Catholic Church. "Faith is not the absence of doubt, my son. It is persistence despite doubt." The Pope reached out and touched the reddish water. "Like this spring, which persists hidden for centuries, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I don't understand why it appeared just now," confessed Anthony. "Perhaps because now there was someone willing to dig deep enough," replied the Pope with a meaningful smile. "Someone who, even without complete faith, had enough faith not to give up." In a gesture that surprised everyone, Pope Francis knelt with some difficulty beside the small well. He made the sign of the cross over the water and pronounced a simple blessing, asking that this spring bring not only physical relief but also spiritual relief to the community. When he stood up, he turned to Anthony with a determined expression. "This water should not only be used during my visit, Anthony. It should be the beginning of something lasting for Dry Gulch." "Are you suggesting an irrigation system?" asked Anthony, surprised by the practical direction the conversation was taking. "Exactly," replied the Pope. "Faith without works is dead, as Scripture says. This spring, however small it may be, can be the beginning of a transformation for your community, if it is managed with wisdom and justice." The next morning, during the official celebration in the now impeccably prepared square, Pope Francis surprised everyone by deviating from his planned speech. He told of his early visit to the spring, described Anthony's perseverance and Michael's prophetic dream, and then asked everyone present to taste the spring water, which had been brought in jugs decorated by the catechism children. "This water," he said into the microphone, his calm voice echoing through the silent square, "is not miraculous because it cures diseases, although perhaps it does through the minerals it contains. It is miraculous because it reminds us of an essential truth. Even in the driest land, there is water hidden for those who have the courage to dig deep enough." In the days following the Pope's departure, reports began to emerge. People who drank the water reported relief from chronic pains, renewed strength, a general feeling of well-being. Among them, curiously, was Sebastian Mendoza himself, who had secretly drunk it to expose what he considered a hoax. Touched by what he called an inexplicable healing experience, the farmer made a surprising announcement during the following Sunday Mass. He would donate equipment to expand the well system in the region and regularize the use of water from the reservoir he controlled, establishing a fair and affordable price. "I understood," he said before the astonished community, "that water belongs to no one. It is a gift for everyone, as the Holy Father reminded us." The real miracle, however, revealed itself in the following weeks. The water analysis carried out by experts sent by the diocese showed rare mineral properties with proven health benefits. The red clay contained high levels of iron and other essential trace elements that explained, at least partially, the reported beneficial effects. Even more impressive was the irrigation system developed under Anthony's leadership. Using his deep knowledge of the terrain and ancestral techniques rediscovered in the documents found by Clara, they managed to maximize the use of spring water, feeding small community gardens that, within 3 months, already showed the first signs of green life amid the arid landscape. A year after the papal visit, Dry Gulch was no longer the same. The adobe houses gained new layers of plaster, painted in bright colors that reflected the new spirit of the place. The children, still running barefoot through the streets, now stopped to drink fresh water in community fountains installed in strategic locations. The gardens gradually expanded, producing food that, if not abundant, at least ensured that no one else suffered extreme hunger. Anthony, now respected as the natural leader of the community, had found a new form of spirituality. It was not the traditional and unwavering faith of yesteryear, nor the bitter skepticism of the years of extreme drought. It was something more subtle, a deep connection with the land, with the people, with the daily work that now produced visible fruits. One afternoon, while supervising the new channeling system that would carry water from the spring to more distant areas, Anthony found Clara organizing a special celebration in the grotto. They had built a small chapel there, combining traditional Christian elements with symbols that honored the ancestral wisdom of those lands. "Did the Father approve?" asked Anthony, observing the indigenous symbols carved in wood that decorated the simple altar. Clara smiled. "He said that true faith always finds expression in the local culture, that what is important is the spirit, not the exact form." Anthony nodded, a soft smile on his face previously marked only by weariness and worry. "You know, Clara, I'm still not what you would call a devout man, but I understand now what the Pope meant about digging deep enough." "And what did he mean?" she asked, genuinely curious. "That faith, like water in the desert, often flows along invisible paths before emerging where we least expect it. That, what is important is not so much where we find it, but what we do with it after we discover it." Clara smiled, her eyes shining with the same intensity as that day she brought the old documents. "Is that why the Pope asked us to change the name? Back to Valley of Promise?" "Perhaps," replied Anthony, looking at the horizon where, for the first time in many years, rain clouds were timidly forming. Or perhaps because every dry land holds in its depths the promise of renewal. And as the sun set over the Valley of Promise, no longer Dry Gulch, light raindrops began to fall, first hesitant, then with increasing confidence like liquid blessings upon a rediscovered land, and a people who, like their sacred spring, had rediscovered their strength in the depths.